With God, there is always more. More love, more life, more freedom. Welcome to Zoe's Exploring More with Michael Thompson. C.S. Lewis once wrote, "Our Heavenly Father has provided many delightful inns for us along our journey, but He takes great care to see that we do not mistake any of them for home." Join me and the team as we explore the kingdom together, discovering the deep truths and offering encouragement for the journey. There is always more. Welcome, friends and allies, to the Exploring More podcast with Michael Thompson. I am hanging out with S.J. Jennings and my friend Keith Daniel. Thanks for coming in, Keith, to continue this conversation, this series of Kingdom in Living Color. And we got to hear a little bit about Keith's story. Yeah, I had to call time out and make a breaking point, Keith. You used a sentence. You used the word diabolical. I think the same sentence or paragraph as a black man in America.
Yeah.
And you'd shared,
the diabolical plans.
Yeah, you'd shared quite. I want to pick up though. I need 5 minutes of this story because you got the Duke clipboard. You were sharing about that at the 50-year celebration, which you made pretty clear as you dove into that. The stories weren't all pretty. There were few things to celebrate, but a lot of perseverance, a lot of hardship and heartache, a lot of pioneering by young men and women of color coming through this institution that was being forced to allow their presence on campus. And many of them, like you said, there are things to celebrate. It's the people and what they survived rather than the institution and what they provided. Is that fair?
Yeah. It was about the people.
It is about them. And then
their stories.
But it was a 9-month event, not a weekend, not an overnight. And so, Keith, I know what that did to you. There were moments, this clipboard started to weigh something.
Yeah. Could
you just share a little bit about that before we then transition, I think, to some of the things that are going on in our country, some of the things that are going on, and because this isn't about this is so significantly important right now, what's going on, but it's the history, it's the effect, it's the cumulative effect, as I've heard you share of its effect on the Black culture. And I just need you to tell some more of that story of what happened to you as you dove into this space of that you didn't see coming. You had no idea what this was going to do to you. Yeah. And would you tell a little bit of that story? Would you honor us with that?
Yeah.
Is that okay?
How can I offer this in a way that, it can, I can feel like I'm breathing into it a little bit. Just as you were inviting me to this question, I got to go back to football, right? So I remember the first time in Little League where I really got my clock cleaned. I was returning a punt, and I was nervous. I was always nervous in returning punts, as most people should be.
We've seen the results, right? Sometimes
you're waiting for the ball to come down, and there's 11 people that
running
are hoping
fast, hard at you.
Separate your head from
shoulder,
the rest of your body. And that may have been the only time I technically would have had a concussion, but back then there wasn't much protocol for that. But I dropped it and went to pick it up, and my head was down. I just got cleaned out. As we got into the commemoration efforts, looking back now, I was able, and doing some research, I realized that it was for the first time I had what is characterized as episodic depression.
Right.
And it's how life is. When you don't know what's going on, it is helpful to get okay, we got the diagnosis, now we can treat this. But I didn't know until sometime after what had happened to me. And looking back, I crumbled under the weight of my own reckoning with who I was as an African-American man, seeking to manage my life and the significance of the commemorative activities and efforts. And essentially, I was doing too much. But as an African-American man, we're always feeling like we have to do twice as much to be recognized. So we end up with a lot on our shoulders and sort of expected, like, again, you should be able to deal with what's going on in the world and what's wrong with you if you can't. So some of the collision for me was coming to terms that I was not Superman. I breathe just like everybody else. At some point, if I'm constricted, I'm not going to survive. And so the images of Black identity and my identity and what it means to have a lot of weight on my shoulders was, for the first time, I was recognizing I'm a human being. And I can't keep taking blow after blow after blow. And I was awakening to what we call microaggressions in the world of identifying why we're afflicted. We, being African-American men and women, have to carry these afflictions around with us, because every day we're reacting or responding or dealing with microaggressions, while at the same time seeking to be human beings, loving fathers, caring for our communities and our children, and expecting to do that all well in a world that is constantly microaggressions. And then when the macroaggressions come out, then we have implosions like we had currently dealing with these recent killing of African Americans by police, and in some cases by people who not even police anymore, but they still think they're the police, as relates to the tragic killing of Ahmaud Arbery. So the commemoration event officially kicked off in January of 2013. So there was multiple months preparing for that, and a snowstorm. Actually, we had an ice storm that the first event got canceled. But it was kind of ominous because I wasn't able to be at the first event because I was just about to be admitted to the psychiatric ward at Duke University as a result of this episodic depression that had accumulated so much that I could no longer function. I couldn't even menial things. And what precipitated all of that was, like I said, I was doing too much. I actually had taken another responsibility that related to the Black experience at Duke, because the dean of the Divinity School asked me if I would serve as the interim director of the Office of Black Church Studies. So now I have two jobs at Duke, both of them principally focused around the Black experience at the university, and neither of them did I seek after. I was doing my doctoral work. I had started a doctoral program that fall. So fall of 12, I enter a doctoral program. I get a call in August to be the director of the Black Church Studies office. In June, I get the call from the university to direct the commemoration. In August, I get the call to be the interim director of Black Church Studies. You know, my son's just starting high school or something like that. My wife was doing some academic work at the time. And so the storm was brewing about, we're still playing ball. We're still, life is going full throttle. And it just all collapsed on me. And I went into about a 30 or 40-day period of the greatest level of dysfunction to the point where I couldn't open emails anymore. And I had to be prescribed some medications and things to help correct. I went through some other frightening moments because the fear that hit, which again, this is how the enemy works, right? After a period of diminishment, then there's like disillusionment. We talk about being disoriented. Right. All of that was happening. And I got even more scared because I was like, wait a minute, I've never had a panic attack. I mean, when I got to Duke and I was a starting kick returner, it was not nervousness anymore. This was like, I'm built for this. Yeah. But suddenly in my life, I was like, wait a minute, I'm like really scared. I don't know what's happening. Is my heart beating? I'm feeling like I'm, all this blood pressure and all of that. Yeah. So that, I don't even remember what core of your question was when we began this, but right. I had an interpersonal breakdown to the point where that was the beginning of some real spiritual work that had to happen for me to ultimately return and be able to continue to carry on the leadership role that I had for the commemoration. Well,
as your friend, and we had regular intervals of connecting in any given week around different things, whether it would be Zoe or ball or lunch, grabbing time. So I think from what I saw it wasn't just the workload. Mm-hmm. It was the kind of work.
Yeah.
It was being entrusted with a responsibility that was actually, telling you how I saw it, mm-hmm. being entrusted with a responsibility that was actually unveiling deep grievances, mm-hmm. pain and experiences from your youth, marginalization, mm-hmm. and you were hearing people tell stories that you were having to call upon something to relate to and somehow put that together mm-hmm. in a program of an evening or a gathering of people. And it took a toll. It, like you said, a concussion coming, or if you know anything about concussions, when one comes after another, mm-hmm. this is when real damage is done.
Yeah.
And so this whole part of your story, I want to put hold on that because mm-hmm. I think that's a huge part of your story. Then there's another part of your story that you pulled me into that I think the term is, I knew it, mm-hmm. where I didn't know what was going on in and around me in terms of race. Yeah. When we get to Orr and we talk about that, there was this, I knew it. Mm-hmm. But let's time out on that.
Yeah.
And let's talk a little bit about the diabolical mm-hmm. and being an African-American man. Just need you to share a little bit about, here we are, is it a week?
Well, it's May 25th, I think.
Yeah, so we're going to be, airing this a little bit later, but here we are in a week 10 days window of a tragedy. Here we are coming somewhat out of COVID. That's kind of got the headlines mm-hmm. for the past couple months. Yeah. And it's eventful, mm-hmm. but where were you? How do you want to jump into this?
Yeah, and how did your experience that you gained mm-hmm. at Duke, being in that role, hearing that story, I guess I'm asking you to bring your experiences together.
Yeah.
Recent events and mm-hmm. those events from several years ago. How does that look? How did your experience there at Duke influence mm-hmm. you as a man now and the way that you teach and lead in mm-hmm. this area?
Yeah. The pivotal part of your question is Duke University does not shape who I am.
Okay.
Right. And that was part of my coming of age, my second coming of age, mm-hmm. was my identity is not in Duke University.
Yeah.
But you got to think that's a big deliverance, right? I show up at Duke, I'm 18 years old. And I'm looking for, like every college kid, the best 4 years of your life, not the next 30, right?
Yeah.
And so much of my glory and identity is associated with Duke University, and I am 99% utterly proud about that. But I struggled with that because I said, God, the rest of my life cannot be inside this bubble of Duke University, as beautiful as the bubble is. So when I resigned from the chapel in 2012, part of that was like, I get to go be and do something else beyond what this university employs me to be.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
It's one thing to be an alum, you love your university. And again, I made reference to Grant Hill earlier in our episode. Mm-hmm. And I was like, it's one thing to be celebrated, like as a look at this alumni from our university that we can and want to embrace that. But for me, it was, I've been here all of my adult and professional life, and I'm concerned that that's all that I am. Mm-hmm. And I think, SJ, you asked at a break or when we were talking earlier, references to football. Well, my belonging at Duke wasn't tied because I got there because I was a football player. I actually walked on the football team and earned the full scholarship in my second year. And that even makes me even more like elated that this place gave me a shot.
Right.
Right. So to take it to today in America, what does it mean for a Black man to be a proud American, but then have to relive with the history of America? Mm-hmm. That it was built off of our backs. Mm-hmm. And even today, our necks are being broken And then to reflect on our bodies, what does it mean to like deal with the lynching history in America and the thousands of people who were lynched for nothing? What is it like to look at a body of an Emmett Till, a child who's wrongly accused to be beaten to the point you can't his mother cannot recognize him? And she says, I want his casket to be open for the world to see. Talk about diabolical, right? So when you start to walk through that history, like really deliberately and slowly, yeah, if you have a heart, it should crush it. It should crush it almost to the point where you have no heart anymore. But by God's grace and that church that formed me, that the cross is more powerful than anything, it can't be crushed. Then if there's resilience that I have today, I attribute it to the kingdom of God as it unfolded for me through First Baptist Church and through other movement leaders, not just Dr. King. And I walked the trail. I know the story is far more than Dr. King. So I know the names from the Ella Baker to Mary McLeod Bethune and the litany of names that suggest to me that there's a God in heaven that makes me whole, despite whether or not the world makes me whole. So whether or not
just like Duke doesn't make you whole.
Exactly.
Right? Mm-hmm.
And we know, again, in our lives, our work and our places of association, they make up who we are. We talk about it all the time. Mm-hmm. Where'd you go to school, man? Who'd you play for?
Right.
Who was your coach?
Oh, yeah.
You know, that's a part of the narrative. But in my journey, and this is the way God wants all of us to do, right? Who is your true identity in?
Yeah.
Don't get it twisted. You know, we've constructed the race. Whites constructed the race. It's a construct, which means it can be deconstructed.
Yeah. Yeah. Amen.
It can be resisted. And we know as part of the kingdom, we're told we can resist the enemy.
Yeah.
And so
one of the things you did for me, Keith, in your patience and kindness in bringing awareness to me, I think one of the positions I probably held at one time was that detachment that's convenient, right? That, well, that's not really my history. Mm-hmm. And again, you know, you didn't explode but you brought me along to rethink and refeel that this history's our history. You know, even my assumption of at one point where that's not my history, that just speaks of the white black thing. You know, I wasn't in the South at the time, you know, or I wasn't born at the time, or whatever can kind of be the construct, you know, that's a screw or a nail that just kind of supports your little part of it. And so as you took me around to different, you know, positions on this, I had to rethink. I had to, because I couldn't not see, like you said, when you see it, you can't not see it anymore. And it's history. It's our history. It's the history of human beings. It's the history of what we've done to one another. Mm-hmm. And when there's enough cards in one pile and not many cards in another as to who the victims are and who the casualties are, over time, it's irrefutable. And then from seeing and awareness comes the invitation, right, to rethink. Mm-hmm. And from the rethinking, maybe an opportunity to do something. But we'll get to that after the break.
Yeah.
Hey listeners, SJ here. Just want to tell you about a couple of upcoming events we have. We're doing 2 Heart of a Warrior Encounter weekends this fall. The first one is in Underwood, Indiana at the Country Lake Retreat Center, Thursday through Sunday, August 20th through the 23rd, 2020. And then the other one is at Young Life Trail West in Buena Vista, Colorado, Thursday through Sunday, October 15th through the 18th, 2020. During these Heart of a Warrior Encounter weekends, we have 3 main objectives. We want to help a man get his heart back, teach him how to fight, and show him where the battles are. Join the squadrons of men who are hungry and thirsty for more. The kingdom needs more men who know what it is to walk deeply with God. Come join us and be one of the men who is seeking and finding more. Visit zoe.org/events for more information.
Welcome back to the Exploring More podcast, talking with my friend Keith Daniel, hanging out with SJ, talking about the kingdom in living color. And Keith, thanks for inviting us into your story, your experience and history, yours personally, and then a much larger history. You know, I ended part one with a pretty large statement about seeing these privileges, seeing the construct, seeing being made aware of a history that frankly, it was a chapter in high school in a book. It was maybe an American history class in college, but it's far more than that. There's a lot more to it. There's a lot of great storytellers that are coming out in this last century, this last decade. There's a lot of films that have been made this last decade that have really brought history to the forefront. 12 Years a Slave. I remember when Alex Haley's Roots.
Oh, I remember. We watched that.
I was junior high,
miniseries,
and watching through that. That was that had an effect on me.
Oh my gosh!
But it still seemed like it was kind of a world far, far away. So let's jump back in to this world here and now, and let you share some more of your commentary, your sense on this diabolical. You even related the assassination of Martin Luther King in the 60s to this current assassination, right? And even speaking that way, I think elevates and honors, at the same time bringing tragedy to these deaths of the last month.
Yeah. So how am I dealing with the events of this current month? And right now I'm at a place where I'm asking God, as it relates to my white friends, who God has given me a good handful of. I call them surprising friendships, and I think I named ours to be that way. Because God really wants to come for your hearts as well, as much as he's come for mine and others in the African-American community who still believe that there's a God in heaven who came to us in Jesus Christ. For those who are on the Christian journey and the training of the movement, in which I was ushered into, was that we're supposed to love our neighbors and our enemies. So I'm trying to press into what it means to love my white brothers and sisters well when the narrative continues to unfold that white supremacy is so strong in our country, from the highest office and its full expose of it down to our daily lives, and how our institutions and churches and so much functions around the racist realities that are in our world. So part of my journey as it relates to the tears and the pain of watching this particular killing of George Floyd, and then processing through the killing of Ahmaud Arbery, and then Sister Breonna, and others, they're asking us to say their names. And again, for me, having been on this earth 50 plus years, most recently visited, last year I went to the Equal Justice Initiative, the Peace and Justice Memorial in Montgomery, and looked at all those names of people who had been lynched, right? The thousands of names that have been people lynched all over this country. And to take in that and still come up and say, I'm called to love my white brothers and sisters. And what does love look like in light of the fact this history is really in living color for me right now? It's on full display in the American psyche right now, because we've seen what we want to believe 100% of the people would agree is a criminal offense that deserves full justice to the fullest extent of the law. We want to believe that, but history tells us that the outcome is not a given. And so living under that weight and oppression it's essentially impossible. And the only way it's made possible is through Jesus Christ, and for those of who cling to that, right? Because the fact that I don't self-destruct out of this system is a miracle. If the enemy would have the enemy's way, it would be for me to really hate you more. And again, it's not interpersonal anymore. It's that you represent a system that is designed to give you every advantage. Mm-hmm. And the authority to do at will what you choose to do with me and bear no consequence for it. Go back in time and I say, well, okay, I arrived on the earth when the signs weren't up. I didn't have to go to the back door. I wasn't told to step off the side.
When you say signs, you mean whites only, colored only?
Whites only, thank you. Mm-hmm. The visible signs had been taken down.
Right.
But all the social norms and expectations, they didn't go away the moment the signs were taken down. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, if I was out of line as a black man and asserted my humanity in any way that even appeared threatening to you, then my life's on the line. Mm-hmm. So I got two choices. I go get my gun and it's all out war, or I submit and surrender and not be a man anymore, right? So the complexity of all this is so deep and hard that by God's grace, through patience and time, we're supposed to try to wade through this water together. But the risk that I run is after I've explained it all to you and you step back and are like, oh, ho hum. Mm-hmm. There's not much I can do. And now it's pity and sorrow and no transformation of your heart to make you become more and overcome white supremacy, just as I've overcome black inferiority. Mm-hmm. That is the space that I'm in right now. My conversations with my other friends, African-American friends, peers, associates, colleagues, in a lot of different contexts, is they're figuring out how to bear under the insensitivity, the dismissal. Mm-hmm. Like, why are y'all burning up your stuff? And why are you rioting? And even though we're seeing a more diverse participation in riots and a more diverse participation in marching than we
protests,
than we had in the 60s and in the movement for civil rights. But the invitation that comes from white peers, white friends or associates to say, as you're saying now, Michael, and by God's grace, this podcast is going out, to many, to possibly open eyes and ears to what more can you do? Mm-hmm. What more can we do to address the pain and the despair and the anger and the frustration that you're feeling from our humanity?
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
There was a time when this really upgraded for you, when you saw what you didn't see. And I remember you pulling me into some education, some training, some exposure. What I love looking back is you knew what you were doing to me. Mm-hmm. I had no idea, but because it was you, all right, where are we going? What are we doing?
Yeah.
And so, but there's two phrases, right? The one that I need you to tell a little story about is the story that the headline is when you said to me, explaining some of this narrative, but the punchline, the headline was, I knew it. Do you remember that? The whole, as we stepped through and as we stepped into kind of some racial, it wasn't reconciliation, it was understanding.
Or being an acronym.
Yes.
Right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What is that?
Organizing against racism.
Okay, cool.
So there was training in that, and Keith brought me that. And when then you told me that it was, I think I was your second time through with that, but it was through that training that you came out going, I knew it, because they showed you over a few days this system, the construct. Would you just that's what that story, because we're talking about the history that makes this current reality so important to see what it's part of, what it's been a part of.
It's not an isolated incident.
And how perpetuating it's been. Thousands of names, in honor of their murders. But there was a moment where you said to me that you finally saw, I knew it. I knew I was opposed. I knew there was more that I didn't see and comprehend. Can you speak to that for?
Yeah. Thanks for kind of reframing. It's interesting how communication works. It's, you hear a phrase like, I knew it, and it's like, it's an aha moment versus I already knew this, right? My mother was she was an equal employment director as a civilian for the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Navy. And so I grew up in a household where my mother was responsible for holding the government accountable to its practices around affirmative action. And the reason I relate that here is because, again, as a child, you don't know what you don't know.
Yeah.
And like, you look back, I now understand what mama was doing.
Yeah, I didn't know what my
Right.
dad did
Yeah.
in sales or what his job really meant.
Or
But
you,
yeah.
or
until
you
did.
didn't know that we often say, well, I'm glad mama spanked me in that sense, or I'm glad mama corrected me. I didn't know mama knew what she was preparing me for, right? I mean, we talk about in the Black community, conversations you have to have about, okay, if you get stopped by the police, this is what you do to stay alive, right? You don't realize that's a part of your socialization, that they're intentionally teaching you ways to survive America, right? And the white supremacist reality that's out there, right? So when we attended the Racial Equity Institute training that's put on by Organizing Against Racism, the 2-day workshops, and I got you to attend, you probably caught me in a moment where I was reaffirming, I knew mama was teaching me all along. And in some cases, my aunts and uncles and grandparents. Now, remember, I grew up in Washington, D.C., and I grew up in Durham, North Carolina, because my parents are Durham natives. So I got aunts and uncles and people that migrated north, participated in a system that was a bit more liberal and open. And then you come south, and it's all about surviving the racial unwritten narrative and explicit, And so the racial equity training, as it would dial back through history, it did put some layers on to what I didn't know, but I was probably more expressing, now it's even more crystal clear.
Right.
So when they pointed out historically, so they asked the question, when was affirmative action instituted? And for the naive and the unaware, it's, right around the civil rights era, they made affirmative action so that blacks could be hired, and they had to, you had to interview them, and you had to, fill a quota. And it was like, well, no, actually whites have gotten affirmative action. Let's take you back in history, beginning with what was provided for you when you got to this country that you took over in the way of supplies and a gun and basic
Land.
rights to land and things like that. And he was like, that's affirmative action. That's action taken so that you can actually benefit from what's available to you, right? And then they went back through other bringing up to modern times in terms of the GI Bill or Social Security. And we're like, well, the GI Bill, most of that went to whites coming back from the war to and help build the university systems because federal money was being poured in for whites. Social Security, if you 12 years a slave, one of the pivotal scenes is, I got to keep working. Social Security is not available to me as a domestic worker. So I got to work all my life. And actually, the only way I can improve my lot is if you give me raises. But I got to work till I die as a black person. We're all in the housekeeping and domestic service. So the layers are being peeled back like, oh my God, we're made to feel like when the federal government steps in to reconstruct the landscape so that we can live out these ideals of equality and equity, part of the diabolical reality is that we're coming to the game way late.
Yeah.
You now own all the property and land. They use the monopoly analogy. The game started hours ago. And now you're saying, get your $200 and try to pass go and get some stuff. And like every step I make, I'd actually rather be in jail because I'm being crushed by the economic system. So that's what the racial equity. And so, there were these moments where it breaks and it's like, I knew, and now I know more.
Yeah.
And I'm not crazy as a Black person because maybe I'm still in poverty. And my poverty is not a reflection of my identity that I'm lazy or I haven't worked hard enough. My poverty is a result of a system that was not built for me and actually it's morphed and regressed whenever I started to make gains. So when Wilmington burns down in 1898, when they burn Wilmington down, they burn it, the whites burn it down because Blacks had began to acquire political power and economic stability. And they basically had a military uprising and ripped people out of buildings. That's the Wilmington riots. There's been documentaries on that. So as you said, over the last decade, there have been increasingly documentaries and historical
exposure,
reckoning,
telling the stories.
And what's happening, Blacks are like, many of us are getting liberation from that history being somewhat for the first time really coming to terms with it, because it's saying, okay, I'm not crazy as a Black person, though I may still be dealing with, the crazy reality and drama that afflicts my community when you force us into poverty, right? And if we don't break out of it, if I'm not some genius entertainer or rock star football player that can get out of the hood, my chances are, my vision as an African American is I got to make you laugh. Well, I got to run a doggone ball down the field or dunk it. Still, the narrative is still, y'all can entertain. And so if a few of y'all make it out and be doctors and make it to be lawyers or make it to the presidency, racism is done now. And we're like, no, not at all.
Right.
For far too many.
Yeah.
So I probably should take a breath.
No, that's a good place to pause, I think.
It's probably a good place to land.
Right. Hey, listeners, thank you so much for being with us today. And if you've got questions or comments, anything you want to say to us, our email address is exploringmore@zoe.org. And if you'd do us a favor of leaving us a rate and review on your podcast platform of choice, it really helps us out. Thank you to Serena and Brooke, our awesome sound engineers. And thank you again to Keith for being with us today. We'll see you next time.
We hope you have enjoyed this episode of Exploring More. The landing page for this podcast is zoe.org/podcast. That's ZOWEH.org/podcast, where you can find the show notes and various platforms to which we broadcast. You can also find us and the life of More by visiting Zoe on YouVersion Bible app, Right Now Media, our Facebook page, and Zoe on Instagram and Twitter. Remember, with God there is always more, and you were made for more.